The village was unlike any other. Nestled deep in the mountains, where mist rolled through the trees like whispers from another world, it remained untouched by time. The houses were old, with crumbling stone walls and roofs that had seen better days. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Most people, when they passed through, would stop only to rest before heading on their way. But those who stayed long enough to learn about the village's history quickly discovered that there were things buried here. Secrets, shadows, memories, things that would make anyone reconsider their decision to stay. It wasn't that the village was cursed. No, at least not in the way that people often think of curses, with black magic and obvious signs of the supernatural. It was more subtle. The villagers knew this place held something ancient and powerful. And they knew deep down that no one who dared to uncover the truth would leave unchanged. They lived with it. In silence, they carried the weight of the knowledge that their village was tethered to a history few could comprehend, a history woven with fear, rituals, and blood. Somewhere in the heart of this village, tucked between decaying bookshelves in a dusty attic, lay a secret so dark that even the most hardened historians and archaeologists, upon stumbling upon it, would hesitate. They would turn away, walk out, and perhaps never return. The documents were incomplete, old, barely legible. But they spoke of a time long ago, a time when the village was not a peaceful haven for the weary traveler but a place where the very land itself seemed to call out for something unnatural. There was one man who came to the village, a historian who had heard only whispers of this ancient ritual. His name was Adam Carter, a scholar of ancient history and rituals, fascinated by the obscure and the forgotten. He had spent his career studying lost civilizations and the rituals that once defined them. But nothing, not even the most bizarre myths he had come across, prepared him for what he was about to uncover. Adam had always believed that history was something to be studied, understood, and eventually shared with the world. But as soon as he set foot in the village, it was as if the past itself refused to let him go. The first sign that something was wrong came when he entered the village tavern. The locals, who had been laughing and sharing stories just moments before, fell silent the moment Adam stepped through the door. The murmur of conversation ceased, replaced by the creak of chairs as people shifted uncomfortably. Adam could feel their eyes on him, heavy, watchful, as if they were trying to assess whether he was someone to be trusted or someone to be feared. "Can I help you, stranger?" The bartender's voice was gruff, his words deliberate, as if he were choosing them carefully. "I'm just passing through," Adam said, trying to keep his tone light. "I'm a historian. I'm interested in the history of this village." The bartender gave him a look, one that could have been mistaken for suspicion, but Adam couldn't quite tell. "There's nothing here worth knowing," the man said flatly. "You'd best be on your way." But Adam wasn't deterred. He had been in enough remote towns to recognize the warning signs, the reluctance to share history, the tight-lipped locals who preferred to keep their pasts buried. He wasn't going to give up that easily. Determined, Adam made his way to the village's small library. Inside, there was a woman named Eleanor, an elderly librarian who had lived in the village her whole life. She had the kind of face that told stories without saying a word. Lines etched into her skin spoke of years spent in silence, years spent witnessing the village's history unfold, but never daring to speak of it. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, eyeing Adam with a knowing look. "I'm looking for records of the village's history," he said. "Anything that might explain its origins." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. She hesitated before speaking. "Why would you want to know about that?" Her voice was soft, but there was a sharpness in it, a quiet alarm. Adam smiled, trying to ease the tension. "Just curious. I've studied many villages and everyone has a story. I'm sure this place is no different." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then motioned for him to follow her. She led him to a back room where the older records were kept. The dust in the room hung thick in the air, as if the past itself had been waiting for someone to return. She pulled a large, worn book from the shelf and placed it in front of Adam. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. As he flipped through the pages, something about the words seemed off. There were mentions of sacrifices, strange rites performed during the darkest nights of the year. And then there were the symbols, cryptic marks drawn in the margins as if someone had added them after the fact, a warning perhaps. "The ritual," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was done to keep the land peaceful, to ensure no harm came to the village." Adam paused, his eyes flicking to the librarian. "What kind of ritual?" She lowered her voice even further. "A sacrifice. An offering. Some believe it kept the land fertile, others say it kept something far worse at bay. But it has been a long time since anyone spoke of it, and I would prefer it stayed that way." The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke. Adam's mind raced. The ritual was tied to the land. Was it a superstition? A story to keep people in line, to make them believe in something greater than themselves? Or had something more sinister been at play? The more he read, the more questions grew in his mind, but the answers were elusive. Eleanor stood silently, watching him, her expression unreadable. She knew what he was thinking, but whether she intended to warn him or discourage him was unclear. "You should leave," she said, her voice low. "Some stories are best left forgotten. If you keep digging, you may not like what you find." But Adam, undeterred, continued to read. Each page he turned only deepened the mystery. It was clear that something had happened here, something that had been covered up for generations. And the more he uncovered, the more it became apparent that the villagers weren't simply superstitious, they were terrified. The ritual hadn't been forgotten. It had been buried, hidden away in the darkest corners of their history, and now something was stirring. Adam closed the book, his mind swirling with the implications of what he had just discovered. There were gaps in the history, pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. The villagers had forgotten, or perhaps they had chosen to forget. But there were those who still remembered, those who understood the price of ignoring the past. And as Adam left the library that evening, the weight of their gaze followed him, a silent warning that perhaps he should have left like everyone else. But Adam couldn't walk away. He had already stepped too far into the darkness, and the answers, whatever they might be, were just out of reach. And as he would soon learn, some mysteries were never meant to be uncovered. Adam couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As he left the library and stepped into the fading light of the afternoon, the air seemed to press against him, heavy with unspoken warnings. The village felt different now, its silence more oppressive, its stillness unnerving. It was as if the buildings themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. He made his way down the winding road, past the small homes where families had lived for generations, and towards the edge of the village. The further he walked, the more isolated he felt, as though the town was receding into the mist that had begun to creep over the mountains. He couldn't stop thinking about what Eleanor had said. Some stories are best left forgotten. The words echoed in his mind, warning him that he was dangerously close to uncovering something that could change everything. But Adam wasn't the type to back down from a mystery, not one this compelling. The ritual, the references to offerings and sacrifices, the strange symbols in the old book, it all pointed to something much bigger than a simple superstition. It felt like the key to understanding the village, its people, and the land itself. And Adam, driven by his insatiable curiosity, was determined to uncover the full story. He stopped at a small cafe on the outskirts of the village to gather his thoughts. It was a quaint little place, with ivy creeping up the sides of the stone walls and a worn wooden sign that creaked in the breeze. Inside, the tables were empty except for an elderly couple seated by the window, their conversation a low murmur in the background. Adam took a seat in the corner, pulling out the journal he had been carrying since his arrival. It was filled with notes, scribbled observations, and sketches of the symbols he had found in the book. But as he began to review his notes, something caught his eye, an entry he hadn't written himself. It was a note written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. It read, "Do not ask about the ritual. The more you know, the more you risk. Some things are better left buried." Adam felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. This wasn't his handwriting. Someone else had been here, someone who knew what he was looking for, and they had left a warning. A chill crept over him as he glanced around the room. The couple by the window didn't seem to notice him, but Adam felt their eyes on him, the weight of their gaze pressing into his back. They weren't the only ones. The room seemed to hum with quiet tension, as though the very walls were conspiring against him. His fingers trembled as he folded the journal and shoved it back into his bag. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the wooden floor with a harsh sound that made the couple look up. Their eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Adam thought he saw something in their faces, a knowing, a sadness. But they quickly looked away, returning to their quiet conversation, leaving Adam with the sense that he had just crossed an invisible line. As he left the cafe, the weight of the village's silence seemed to grow heavier. It was as though every step he took was being watched, every movement scrutinized by unseen eyes. He was no longer just a curious historian. He was an intruder poking at something that had been buried for far too long. And yet, the more he felt the villagers' unease, the more driven he became to uncover the truth. He decided to visit the village's cemetery. The place was small but ancient, with weathered stones marking the graves of people who had lived here centuries ago. The air was thick with the scent of moss and old earth, and the overgrown ivy seemed to have taken hold of nearly every gravestone, wrapping it in its green tendrils as if trying to pull it back into the ground. Adam wandered among the graves, his footsteps muffled by the soft grass beneath him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, perhaps more clues, perhaps some sign of the ritual's origins. But as he moved deeper into the cemetery, he noticed something that made his heart race. At the farthest corner of the graveyard, almost hidden by a dense thicket of trees, was an old mausoleum. It was crumbling, its stone walls cracked and weathered by time, but there was something about it that drew Adam in. He couldn't explain it, but a deep instinct told him that this place, this mausoleum, held the answers he had been searching for. He made his way toward it, careful to avoid the thick underbrush that seemed determined to obscure it from view. As he approached, he noticed the door. It was heavy, made of dark wood that had rotted in places, its hinges rusted and barely functional. Adam hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should turn back. The air around the mausoleum felt thicker, charged with an energy he couldn't quite understand. But then a sudden impulse overtook him. He reached for the door and pushed it open, wincing as the old wood creaked in protest. Inside, the mausoleum was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of dusk filtering through cracks in the stone. The air smelled musty old. Adam's eyes adjusted to the dimness, and as they did, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the room, surrounded by shattered remnants of stone and old, discolored candles, lay an altar. It was crude, built from slabs of rock, but unmistakably an altar. And on the altar there were markings, symbols drawn in what could only be blood. The same symbols Adam had seen in the old book. The same ones that had haunted him since he first encountered them. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer, his breath shallow. This wasn't just a forgotten relic of the past. It was a place of power, a place where something had once been summoned, something dark, something that still lingered in the air. Adam couldn't tear his eyes away from the symbols, their meaning slowly creeping into his mind. He didn't know what had happened here, but he knew it was important. The ritual had been performed here, no question about it. The blood, the markings, the altar, it all pointed to something horrific. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, he heard a sound. It was faint at first, just a rustle of leaves or perhaps the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct, a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. Adam froze. His heart skipped a beat. The voice was coming from behind him, from the direction of the altar. He turned slowly, dread creeping up his spine, and found nothing. The room was empty, silent, save for the sounds of the wind outside. But the air felt heavier now, thick with something he couldn't explain. And then, in the distance, just beyond the cemetery, there was a movement. A figure, cloaked in shadow, slipping between the trees. Adam's pulse quickened. He had no idea who it was, but he could feel the presence watching him, lingering just out of sight, waiting. The village was full of secrets, and this was just the beginning. The mystery had only just begun to unfurl, and Adam had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The more he uncovered, the deeper he sank into the village's past, the more he realized that the truth would come at a cost he might not be willing to pay. But by then it was already too late. The wind picked up as Adam walked back through the village, a sharp, biting gust cutting through the narrow streets, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. He couldn't shake the image of the mausoleum from his mind. The altar, the blood, the unmistakable symbols that had haunted him from the moment he first encountered them. Each step he took felt heavier, as though the very ground beneath him was pulling him down, unwilling to let go of the dark secret that had been buried for so long. The voice, though faint and distant, lingered in his thoughts. He had heard something, he was sure of it. But when he turned, there had been nothing. Only the creeping shadows of the cemetery. Yet the feeling, the unease that gnawed at him, told him otherwise. He tried to push it aside, to reason with himself that the voice had been the wind, or perhaps his mind playing tricks on him, but deep down, he knew it was more. The ritual was real. It wasn't just a story. The villagers knew something, but they weren't telling him everything. He had seen enough to realize that their fear wasn't just superstition. Something had happened here, something that still held power over them. And whatever it was waiting for him to uncover it. As he passed the village square, Adam saw the familiar faces of the villagers, each one watching him with quiet suspicion, their gazes following his every movement. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of a door or the shuffle of feet on the cobblestones. It wasn't a welcoming place, but it was clear that Adam had crossed a line. The veil that had once shielded him from the truth was slowly lifting, and what he was seeing was far darker than anything he had imagined. He made his way to the inn, a small stone building with a thatched roof that seemed to sink into the ground with age. The innkeeper, a stout man named Gregor, had been kind enough to offer him a room for the night. But tonight, Adam felt a sense of unease as he entered. The fire in the hearth cast long shadows across the walls, and the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. It felt colder than it should have, as though the warmth of the fire wasn't enough to ward off the chill creeping in from outside. Gregor was behind the bar, polishing a glass. He looked up as Adam entered, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if weighing something in his mind. Adam forced a smile and approached the bar, trying to shake off the sense of being watched. "I'll have a drink, Gregor," Adam said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil he was feeling inside. The innkeeper nodded and poured a glass of amber liquid, sliding it across the bar toward him. "Long day, eh?" he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Adam took the drink, nodding absently. "Something like that," he muttered, staring into the glass. His mind was racing. What had he uncovered? The ritual, the symbols, the altar in the mausoleum, it all seemed so connected, yet so fragmented. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle where the pieces didn't quite fit. He needed answers. But the villagers weren't talking. And every attempt to get closer to the truth felt like it was pushing him further into a web of silence and dread. Gregor leaned in slightly, his voice low. "You've been asking questions," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "Some questions that maybe you should leave unanswered." Adam met his gaze, surprised by the shift in the innkeeper's demeanor. There was something in his eyes now, something that spoke of years spent living with fear, of knowledge too dangerous to share. For a moment, Adam considered asking about the ritual, about the villagers' refusal to speak, but he stopped himself. The last thing he needed was to push the innkeeper too far. The air in the room felt thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. "I'm just curious," Adam said finally, trying to keep his voice casual. "I'm a historian and I like to understand the past. I came here to learn more about the history of this place. But it seems like the village has its secrets." Gregor looked around the room, ensuring no one was listening, before leaning even closer. "There are some things you don't want to know, Adam," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things that, if you dig too deep, will find a way to drag you down into the darkness." Adam's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The innkeeper glanced at the fire, his face hardening. "This village," he said slowly, "was founded on blood. The ritual, the sacrifices, it wasn't just some old superstition. It was part of the land, part of the very soul of this place. And every year it takes what it needs to survive." Adam frowned, leaning in. "What are you saying? That the ritual is still happening?" Gregor's eyes flickered with something close to fear. "I'm saying that you need to stop looking, Adam. Some things don't die. They just wait." The innkeeper turned away as though the conversation had become too much for him. He busied himself with cleaning the bar, avoiding Adam's gaze. The room was silent for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Adam could feel the weight of Gregor's words hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. He had uncovered more than he had bargained for. The ritual wasn't just some ancient act. It was alive, part of the very fabric of the village. And if Gregor was right, it wasn't something that could be stopped. It had never really ended. Adam finished his drink in silence, the bitterness of the alcohol doing little to numb the growing dread inside him. He stood up and thanked Gregor, who didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the flames. As Adam made his way upstairs to his room, he could feel the eyes of the villagers on him again, each one watching from their windows, each one knowing something he didn't. He reached his door and paused for a moment, staring at the wooden frame as if it held the answer to everything. But there was no answer. Only the growing sense that the truth was slipping further from his grasp with each passing minute. In his room, Adam closed the door behind him and locked it, as if the simple act of sealing himself inside might protect him from what was out there. The room was small, with a single bed and a worn chair by the window. He opened his journal again, flipping through the pages, rereading his notes. The symbols, the altar, the voice, everything was connected. But how? And why had the villagers gone to such lengths to bury the past? He had to know. He had no choice. Adam was too deep now, too entangled in the village's web. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he had to uncover the truth. But as he sat there, writing, the wind outside howled louder, and a sudden sharp knock at the door made him jump. He froze, his pen hovering over the paper. A second knock came, more insistent this time. Adam hesitated. Who could it be? His mind raced. The innkeeper? A villager? Or something else entirely? He slowly stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He crossed the room and reached for the door, his hand trembling as he turned the handle. When he opened it, there was no one there. Just the cold night air and the silence of the village stretching out before him. But as he looked down, he saw something on the ground, a small, folded piece of paper. With a sense of dread gnawing at him, Adam bent down and picked it up. He unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the words written in hurried script. "Leave now, before it's too late. You've been warned." Adam's breath caught in his throat. The warning was clear, and it was from someone who knew exactly what was at stake. The village, the ritual, the darkness, it was all real. And now there was no turning back. Adam couldn't sleep that night. The words on the note burned into his mind, their warning echoing relentlessly in his thoughts. "Leave now, before it's too late. You've been warned." The phrase wasn't just a caution, it was a declaration. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone who wanted him to stop and was willing to go to terrifying lengths to make sure he did. But leaving wasn't an option. Adam was too far in, too deep into the mystery of the village and the dark ritual that lay hidden in its past. Every fiber of his being told him that he couldn't walk away now. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of silence and fear, and he was determined to unearth it. The next morning, the village seemed quieter than ever. The mist had settled thick over the streets, shrouding the world in a ghostly veil. Adam stepped out of the inn, the door creaking behind him, and felt the weight of the place press down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The villagers went about their business, their faces expressionless, but their eyes, those eyes, followed him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. They knew what he was after, and they wanted him to stop. The question was, what were they afraid of? He made his way back toward the library, hoping to find more information. Eleanor, the librarian, was there as he expected. She greeted him with the same unreadable look that had made him uneasy the first time they met. There was no warmth in her gaze, no curiosity, only the shadow of something darker. Something she knew but was unwilling to share. "You came back," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I have to understand what happened here," Adam replied, his voice steady but his heart pounding in his chest. "There's something buried in this village's past, and I need to know what it is." Eleanor didn't respond right away. She seemed to be weighing her words, as though considering whether or not to say what was on her mind. Finally she spoke, her voice low and heavy. "Not all truths are meant to be uncovered, Adam. Some things are better left in the dark." Adam could feel the weight of her words, but he wasn't deterred. "I don't believe that. People deserve to know the truth. It's the only way to put this to rest." She sighed, and for a moment, Adam thought she might try to stop him. Instead, she nodded towards the back of the library, where a small section of old, brittle books lay. "There are more records. But I warn you, what you find may not be what you expect. Some things are meant to stay buried." Adam nodded, a mix of anticipation and dread pooling in his stomach. He knew this was it, the last piece of the puzzle. He walked towards the back of the library, where rows of dusty volumes lined the shelves. He started pulling books down, flipping through them quickly, his eyes scanning for anything that might shed light on the ritual, the village's dark history. Most of the books were accounts of the village's past, insipid, dry records of births, deaths, marriages. But then he found something different. A small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. It wasn't a history book. It was something far more personal. As Adam opened the book, he immediately saw that it was written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The ink was smudged in places, and the handwriting was erratic, as though the writer was desperate to get their thoughts down before they were lost forever. It was a journal, a record of someone who had lived in the village during a time long past. The entries were dated, starting from the early 1800s and going all the way through to the early 1900s. Adam's eyes skimmed through the pages, but one entry stood out to him, a passage written in the final years of the journal. It spoke of the ritual, the same ritual that had been referenced in the old books. But there was something more in this account, something that made Adam's heart race. "The ritual is near. The offering must be made before the next full moon. The village will not survive without it. I've seen the signs, the land is dying. The crops fail, the animals fall ill. The people, they grow restless. They say the earth is angry, that it will take what it is owed. I've heard the whispers. The ritual is the only way to keep it at bay. But what if we have been wrong all along? What if we have been offering ourselves to something far darker than we could ever imagine?" Adam's fingers trembled as he read those words. He knew what the journal was saying. This wasn't just about appeasing the earth or the gods or any other benign force. This was something far more sinister. The ritual wasn't just a tradition. It was a desperate attempt to keep something at bay, something that was angry, something that could destroy them all. But what could it be? What had they been feeding with their sacrifices? And why had they gone to such extremes to hide the truth? The journal continued with more frantic entries, detailing the fear and paranoia that had gripped the village in the final years. The writer spoke of the ritual becoming more violent, more desperate with each passing year. It was no longer just about appeasing the earth, it was about survival. The village had become a prisoner to its own traditions. They couldn't escape it no matter how hard they tried. And the writer seemed to realize that the only way to stop it was to destroy the very thing that had given the ritual its power. But there were no more entries after that. The final page was blank, as if the writer had never had the chance to finish their thoughts. Adam's mind raced. Was this the same ritual that the villagers still feared? Was the land still angry? And if so, what had happened to those who had tried to break free from it? As he closed the journal, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He couldn't help but feel that the answers he was looking for were just out of reach, that there was something he was missing. He had uncovered enough to know that the ritual was real, that it was tied to something dark and ancient, but the details, the true nature of the force they had been appeasing, still eluded him. Eleanor appeared beside him, her footsteps soft on the worn floorboards. She had been watching him, her face unreadable. "You've found it, haven't you?" she said quietly, her voice almost sorrowful. Adam nodded, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just read. The ritual, it wasn't just about appeasing the earth, was it? It was to keep something away. Something that could destroy everything. Eleanor's face hardened, her eyes dark with something Adam couldn't place. Fear, guilt, or perhaps both. "It was never just about the earth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ritual was meant to keep something much worse at bay. And now it may be too late." Adam's stomach dropped. Too late for what? She shook her head slowly, as though the words she was about to say could never be taken back. The ritual wasn't just about appeasing the land. It was about holding back something ancient. Something that has always lived here, beneath the surface, waiting. And now it wants to come back. Adam's mind reeled. Something ancient? What could she mean by that? What had they truly been offering to? Before he could ask, Eleanor turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the library. Adam stood there, the journal clutched tightly in his hands, as the weight of her words settled over him. Whatever had been kept at bay for so long was stirring again. And now it was coming for them all. The air was suffocating. Adam could feel it, a palpable heaviness that pressed against his chest as he stood in the dimly lit library. The old journal in his hands felt like a lead weight, its pages heavy with secrets that had been buried for far too long. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. It was never just about the earth. It was about holding back something much worse at bay. Something ancient. Something that has always lived here, beneath the surface, waiting. Waiting for what? As Ellis pressed her for answers, she grew more evasive, her responses increasingly disjointed, until finally she became too agitated to continue the interview. The investigation was leading Ellis to a conclusion that he hadn't expected. A dark, twisted web of deceit that reached far beyond the walls of the asylum. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the fire had not been the result of mere negligence, but something far more calculated. The authorities were either blind to the truth or intentionally ignoring it, but Ellis was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter the cost. He could sense that the survivors were the key, their fragmented memories offering a piece of the puzzle that the official reports had tried to erase. As the investigation reached a boiling point, the detective found himself drawn to one final survivor, a man who had been found unconscious in the building after the fire had been extinguished. This man had been severely burned, his face and hands disfigured beyond recognition, but it was his memory that intrigued Ellis. Unlike the other survivors, this man had not been willing to speak at first, but after much persuasion he began to reveal fragments of his story. His account was more chilling than anything Ellis had heard before. He spoke of strange occurrences in the days leading up to the fire, of seeing staff members in places they should not have been, of hearing whispered conversations that sounded like planning rather than rescue. Most disturbing of all was his final revelation. He had seen the same figures that the others described, moving through the smoke, unaffected by the flames. The detective realized then that the fire wasn't just an accident, it was a calculated act, and the figures the survivors had seen were no mere hallucinations. They were connected to something far more sinister, something hidden deep within the asylum's walls. Ellis felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. What had happened at the asylum that night went beyond a tragic fire. It was part of a much larger, darker scheme, one that had been years in the making. As the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Ellis knew that the investigation was far from over. The truth, he now understood, was buried beneath layers of lies, cover-ups, and corruption. And though he was closer than ever to uncovering it, he also knew that some secrets were far too dangerous to reveal. The more the investigation unfolded, the deeper the mystery became. Detective Ellis had always prided himself on uncovering the truth, no matter how complex or dangerous the case might be, but what he was now uncovering within the asylum's history made him question whether he had stumbled onto something far more sinister than he had anticipated. The survivors' stories, bizarre and unsettling as they were, continued to point in the same direction, a series of connected events that had culminated in the fire, but the further he went, the more the lines between fact and fiction began to blur. As the weeks passed, the detective began to hone in on a single, disturbing possibility, that the fire had not been a random, catastrophic event. It had been set. The timing was too precise, the patterns too deliberate. The official reports had attributed the fire to faulty wiring, yet all the survivors' accounts seemed to contradict this. They spoke of things that should have been impossible. Figures moving through the fire unharmed, voices in the smoke, strange occurrences just before the blaze broke out. If the fire was indeed an accident, how could so many people remember the same disturbing images? How could their accounts align so perfectly despite the trauma, the smoke, and the chaos? Ellis's gut told him that this wasn't just about negligence, it was about something far darker, and the deeper he dug, the more convinced he became that the asylum's history held the key. He began to focus less on the immediate aftermath of the fire and more on the events leading up to it. That's when he uncovered the reports that had long been buried. Whispers of illegal experiments, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of cover-ups that spanned decades. What he discovered about the asylum's administration only deepened his suspicions. For years, there had been rumors of unethical medical experiments taking place behind closed doors. Staff members who had worked at the asylum in the years before the fire spoke of unapproved drug trials and experimental treatments being used on the patients without their consent. Some said they had seen patients who were never seen again, whose records had been erased, and whose families were never informed of their deaths. It was impossible to tell whether these were isolated incidents or part of a systematic effort to hide the truth. But the more Ellis heard, the more it became clear. Something had been happening inside that building that had been intentionally concealed from the public. As he pressed on, it became evident that the asylum was more than just a medical institution. It was a place of secrets, of corruption, and of power. The individuals running the asylum had more than just the care of their patients in mind. They had a far darker agenda, and the fire was, in many ways, the culmination of that agenda. But what was the purpose? What had they been hiding? And how had they managed to cover it up for so long? Ellis's investigation began to focus on a small group of staff members who had been in key positions within the asylum's administration in the years leading up to the fire. They were the ones who had been the most vocal in defending the official narrative, but Ellis soon learned that they had been some of the most involved in the asylum's shadowy dealings. One of them, Dr. Robert Jenkins, a senior psychiatrist who had worked at the asylum for over 20 years, seemed to be at the center of it all. The mausoleum was empty, the only sound the wind rattling through the broken stones. But he could feel it now, the presence. It was in the air, in the ground beneath his feet, and in the shadows that stretched across the walls. It was watching him. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced with the realization that everything he had uncovered had only led him deeper into the darkness. The village was no longer just a place of forgotten history. It was a place of containment, a place where something ancient and malevolent had been held prisoner for centuries. And that something was waking up. Adam stumbled backward, his legs shaking beneath him. He had to leave. He had to warn someone. But as he turned to make his way back to the village, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were coming. His heart thundered in his chest as he sprinted toward the gate, his breath ragged, the weight of what he had uncovered crashing down on him. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in, that something was following him, stalking him through the fog. The village had always been quiet, but now it felt like a trap, a snare tightening around him with every step he took. And as Adam reached the gate, the village seemed to come alive. The ground beneath his feet shook, and a distant, guttural sound filled the air. A sound so primal, so otherworldly that Adam's blood ran cold. The darkness was coming, and the village's ancient secret was about to be unleashed. Adam's breath came in ragged bursts as he pushed himself harder, the weight of his own fear propelling him forward. The gate loomed before him, an iron barrier between the safety of the village and the terror that had begun to unfurl. But the ground beneath him trembled again, more violently this time, and his footsteps faltered. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest, the heavy silence that had fallen over the village broken only by the unsettling rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It wasn't just the ground shaking. It was the very air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Adam felt a cold chill, an unnatural frost that crept up his spine and spread outward. The fog had thickened, swirling around him like a suffocating embrace, and for a moment he thought he saw shadows moving within it, long, twisted shapes that seemed to flicker and writhe in the mist. His mind raced. Was it them? The villagers? Or something worse? He forced himself to turn, facing the graveyard behind him, the mausoleum standing like a forgotten monument to something dark and ancient. He couldn't go back in there, not now. He had uncovered enough to understand that whatever had been kept at bay was now stirring, breaking free from the chains of the ritual that had held it in place for centuries. The power that had once kept it locked away was weakening, and it was coming for him. But there was no turning back. Not now. Adam couldn't just leave, he had to understand what was happening. He had to know what kind of nightmare had been hidden here for so long. His legs moved of their own accord, taking him back toward the center of the village. The fog had thickened even further, now reaching up to his waist in some places. The once familiar streets were now unfamiliar, distorted by the creeping mist. The air felt damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The village was a shadow of itself, its buildings barely visible through the dense fog. He could no longer tell where the road ended and the fields began. The world around him had become an oppressive blur, a nightmare made flesh. As he stumbled forward, a distant sound reached his ears, footsteps shuffling, dragging like the movement of something human. Adam's heart skipped a beat. Who was it? Was it one of the villagers? Or was it something else? He slowed his pace, trying to make himself as silent as possible, but the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel betrayed him. The sound of the footsteps ahead quickened as if the person, or whatever it was, had sensed him and it was closing in on him. Adam's breath hitched. He couldn't see through the fog, but he could feel it now, the presence. Something ancient, something powerful was near. Then, out of the fog, the figure appeared. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His form was hunched, his clothes tattered and stained with something dark, something that looked far too much like blood. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by years of deprivation, and his eyes, those eyes, were wide open but unseeing, vacant, as if the light of life had long ago abandoned him. The man's movements were jerky, unnatural, as if his limbs were no longer his own. And his mouth was slightly open, as though he were whispering something under his breath, but no sound came out. Adam froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He had heard stories, old tales passed down from generation to generation, but seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. This was no ordinary person. This was a revenant, a soul caught between life and death, a servant of whatever dark force lay hidden in the heart of the village. The figure stopped a few feet in front of him, its head tilting as if it were trying to assess Adam. It made no sound, offered no explanation. Its eyes, hollow and empty, stared into his with a chilling intensity. Adam could feel it in his bones. The thing wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something twisted and broken. The ritual had done this to it, had turned it into this empty shell of a person, a vessel for something darker, something that should never have been awakened. For a long moment, Adam and the revenant stood facing each other in silence, the fog swirling around them. Thomas had been one of the few who had escaped the fire unscathed, though his mind had never fully recovered from his time in the institution. He had been released only months before the fire broke out, after a prolonged stay that left him physically and emotionally scarred. His account was fragmented, his memories jumbled, but the pieces he was able to recall painted a disturbing picture of what had been happening behind the asylum's locked doors. Thomas spoke of an increasing sense of unease in the months leading up to the fire. He described how the staff had become more secretive, more distant, as though they were preparing for something. He also recalled overhearing hushed conversations late at night, staff members talking in low voices, whispering about the experiment. What experiment Thomas was referring to, he couldn't say for sure, but the word had stuck in his mind as it had for so many others. Some survivors had mentioned similar conversations, but none could provide specifics. The fact that these whispers persisted among different patients and staff members only deepened Ellis's suspicions that the fire had been part of a larger, more calculated effort to conceal something. There was one night, Thomas recalled, when he overheard something that made his blood run cold. He had been lying in his room, unable to sleep, when he heard footsteps in the hallway. At first he thought it was just another restless patient, but when the steps came closer, he realized that the sound was deliberate, purposeful. It was then that he saw a shadow pass by his door, a figure he recognized but couldn't place. The figure was moving quickly, but Thomas had never seen anyone move like that before, so quietly, so swiftly. He tried to call out, but before he could, the figure disappeared into the darkness. In the days that followed, things began to escalate. More patients were moved into the isolation wing, a section of the asylum that had been previously closed off to the general population. No one knew why and no one dared ask. The staff grew even more guarded and rumors spread like wildfire. But the most unsettling thing was the sudden increase in strange behaviors among the staff. Some were seen talking to themselves, others wandering the halls in a daze, and a few were even reported to have had conversations with patients who were known to have died months earlier. It was as though the asylum had been gripped by an invisible force, one that no one seemed able to resist. Ellis was becoming increasingly convinced that the fire wasn't just an accident or the result of neglected infrastructure. There was a hidden agenda, something that had been brewing in the shadows of the asylum for years. As he pieced together the survivors' accounts, it became clear that there was something more to the so-called experiments than anyone had been willing to acknowledge. The idea that the fire was a cover-up began to take shape in his mind. But why would the fire be set in the first place? What was it that the asylum's administration wanted to hide so badly? As Ellis dug deeper into the asylum's records, he came across a particularly chilling discovery: a series of documents that had been marked classified and hidden away in the administrative offices. These documents referenced something called Project Solace, a program designed to experiment with alternative treatments for mental illness, many of which had been deemed too controversial for mainstream use. Some of the treatments included experimental drugs, invasive procedures, and even electroshock therapies that were far more extreme than anything legally approved. The project's records were sparse, and many of the patients involved had been listed under false names, their true identities obscured. It was clear that the program had been operating in secret, its true nature hidden from the public. But it was the final report on Project Solace that gave Ellis pause. The report detailed the use of a particular chemical substance, one that had been tested on several patients who were described as unfit for regular treatment. The chemical, according to the report, had been administered to induce heightened states of awareness and compliance, though the long-term effects were unknown. The report, dated just a month before the fire, mentioned a sudden spike in adverse reactions among the test subjects, several of whom had reportedly exhibited signs of violent outbursts, paranoia, and hallucinations. But the most troubling part of the report was the final note: subject to be discarded. That phrase haunted Ellis. Subject to be discarded. What did it mean? Was it a euphemism for something far more sinister? Ellis felt as though the walls were closing in on him. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the fire had not been a random accident. It was a calculated act of destruction, a way to erase the evidence of something far darker than anyone had imagined. The subjects involved in these experiments had been discarded like so much refuse, their lives considered expendable for the sake of whatever twisted research the asylum's administrators had been conducting. But the fire had not only consumed the building, it had consumed the very truth of what had been happening inside. It had been a way to destroy the evidence, to eliminate anyone who might have known too much. The survivors, it seemed, were the only ones left to tell the story. With his mounting evidence, Ellis began to confront the surviving staff members. Some of them had already left the asylum, vanishing without a trace, but others remained unwilling to speak. One nurse, a woman named Evelyn, had worked at the asylum for over 20 years. She was among the few who had stayed on after the fire, her role in the aftermath of the disaster minimized to that of a low-level administrator. When Ellis approached her for questioning, she was quiet at first, her face betraying nothing. But as he probed deeper, she began to break down. She confessed that she had seen things during her time at the asylum, things that made her question everything she thought she knew about her profession. She spoke of the patients who had been subjected to unapproved treatments, of the secrecy surrounding the administration's operations, and of the strange experiments that had been conducted in the isolation wing. But when Ellis pressed her about the fire, Evelyn grew silent. "I can't say what I don't know," she finally whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "But I can tell you this, there was something in that building. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And it wasn't just the fire. It was something else. Something we couldn't stop." Her words, cryptic and evasive, left Ellis with more questions than answers. What was it that she couldn't say? What had she witnessed? And why was she so afraid to speak the truth? As Ellis continued his search for the truth, he realized that the answers he sought would not come easily. The deeper he dug, the more layers of deception he uncovered. The asylum was a place of secrets, and those who held the power to protect those secrets were willing to go to any lengths to ensure that they remained buried. The fire, as devastating as it had been, was only the beginning of a much larger story, a story that, if fully revealed, could bring down an entire system. And for Ellis, it was clear that the truth was slipping further and further from his grasp. But even as the investigation faltered, one thing was certain: the survivors were not going to let the truth die with them. They were the key to unlocking the dark history of the asylum, and as long as they lived, the secrets of that night would never be forgotten. As the investigation wore on, Detective Ellis felt himself sinking deeper into a sea of contradictions, unable to break free from the complex web of lies that had been spun around the asylum fire. The more he uncovered, the more the pieces seemed to scatter, leaving him unsure of what was real and what had been fabricated. The survivors' memories, vivid and fragmented as they were, pointed to something far darker than anyone had anticipated. Yet each new discovery only raised more questions, leading him to a terrifying realization: the fire was merely the tip of the iceberg, a calculated act to cover up a much larger, more insidious operation that had been going on for years. In the weeks following his most recent discoveries, Ellis began to connect the dots between the asylum's troubling history, the survivors' testimonies, and the damning evidence he had uncovered from the asylum's records. The fire, he now believed, was not an isolated event but the final act in a long series of cover-ups designed to keep the truth hidden from the public. What was even more alarming was the possibility that the people behind the fire were still at large, moving in the shadows, orchestrating events to ensure that the truth remained buried forever. The deeper Ellis dug into the asylum's past, the more he realized that the building had been more than just a place of treatment for the mentally ill. It had become a breeding ground for something darker, a site for secret experiments, covert operations, and illegal activities that had been conducted under the guise of psychiatric care. The administration had gone to great lengths to cover up their actions, manipulating the system to protect themselves and their research. The patients, often seen as nothing more than expendable subjects, had become pawns in a much larger game, one that no one outside the asylum had any knowledge of. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence that Ellis had come across was the testimony of a former staff member, a man named Peter, who had worked in the asylum's isolation wing during the final months before the fire. Peter had been one of the few to witness firsthand the bizarre and unnerving experiments that were taking place behind closed doors. He spoke of patients being subjected to strange, unapproved treatments that had no basis in medical science. These treatments, Peter explained, were designed to alter the patient's mental states, to push them beyond their limits, and to observe the results. Some of the patients had been given experimental drugs, while others had been subjected to extreme sensory deprivation. The purpose, Peter believed, was to see how far they could push the human mind before it cracked. What was even more disturbing was the fact that these experiments had been conducted under the supervision of some of the asylum's most respected medical professionals. These were not just rogue staff members acting outside the law. They were people who had been given complete control over the lives of the patients, people who had used their positions of authority to carry out unspeakable acts. Dr. Robert Jenkins, the senior psychiatrist whose involvement in the asylum's operations had already raised red flags for Ellis, had been one of the central figures in these experiments. According to Peter, Jenkins had been obsessed with finding new ways to treat mental illness, no matter the cost. He had believed that the end justified the means, that the pursuit of knowledge was more important than the well-being of the patients. Peter described one experiment in particular that haunted him to this day. It had involved a patient named Emily, a young woman who had been institutionalized for severe depression. Jenkins and his team had decided to administer a new drug, one that had never been tested on humans before, to see how it would affect Emily's mental state. The drug was a powerful stimulant, designed to heighten the patient's senses and increase their alertness. But instead of the desired effect, the drug caused Emily to become violently agitated. Her heart rate spiked and she began to experience hallucinations. The staff, rather than intervening, had simply watched, taking notes as Emily spiraled into a frenzy. Peter recalled that the other patients had been terrified, some of them begging the staff to help, but Jenkins had insisted that the experiment must continue. Emily's condition worsened rapidly, and within hours she had collapsed, her body shutting down under the strain of the drug. She died within the next 24 hours, but her death was never reported as an adverse reaction. Instead, the incident was swept under the rug, and Emily's file was altered to reflect that she had simply died of natural causes. The more Ellis listened to Peter's testimony, the more he understood that the fire had not just been a tragic accident. It had been an attempt to destroy the evidence of these experiments, to erase the memory of those who had died as a result of the asylum's dark practices. The administration had known that they were skating on thin ice, that the public could no longer be kept in the dark about the horrors taking place inside the asylum. The fire had been their way of covering up their tracks, of making sure that no one would ever find out the true extent of the atrocities that had been committed under their watch. As Ellis continued to investigate, he began to feel the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on him. It was clear that the fire had been deliberately set, and the survivors' testimonies were the only evidence that could expose the truth. But as more people began to come forward with their own recollections, it became apparent that the fire was not the end of the story, it was merely the beginning. The survivors, many of whom had spent years in the asylum, had witnessed things that went far beyond the fire itself. Some spoke of strange figures who had appeared during the blaze, figures that had moved through the smoke and flames as though they were untouchable. These figures had been seen by multiple survivors, but no one could identify them. Were they hallucinations, the result of smoke inhalation or trauma? Or were they something else entirely, something that the survivors couldn't fully comprehend? Ellis was particularly struck by the testimony of one survivor, a woman named Sarah, who had been a patient at the asylum for over a decade. She had been one of the first to escape the fire, but even after her release, her mind had never fully recovered. Sarah spoke of seeing a man in a suit standing near the epicenter of the fire, his face obscured by the smoke. She described him as cold, detached, almost otherworldly in his calmness. Sarah had tried to speak to him, but when she approached, he simply disappeared into the haze as though he had never been there. She wasn't the only one to have seen him. Several other survivors had described the same figure, a man who seemed out of place, who moved through the fire with a chilling sense of purpose. Ellis couldn't shake the feeling that the fire had been orchestrated by someone with knowledge of the asylum's inner workings, someone who had been able to manipulate the situation to their advantage. The question was, who? Was it Jenkins, the senior psychiatrist who had overseen so many of the asylum's dark practices? Or was it someone else, someone higher up in the hierarchy, pulling the strings from behind the scenes? Ellis's instincts told him that the truth was more complicated than it seemed. There were too many unanswered questions, too many conflicting testimonies, and too much secrecy surrounding the asylum's administration for the case to be solved easily. The more Ellis tried to peel back the layers of the conspiracy, the more he realized that the fire was just one part of a much larger story. The asylum had been a place where people were manipulated, experimented on, and discarded like lab rats, all in the name of science and control. The survivors were the only ones left to tell the story, and their accounts were the key to unlocking the truth.